She didn't ask for a miracle, just one day with the man whose movies helped her face death. When Keanu Reeves read her letter, no one expected what he'd do next. But by the end of that day, an entire hospital would fall silent, and the world would never forget her name. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The pediatric wing at Rosehaven Children's Hospital didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled like cinnamon oatmeal and lavender hand lotion. Claire's favorites. A soft rain tapped against the windows, blurring the view of the gray Oregon skyline. Inside room 27, a 16-year-old girl sat propped up by pillows, a thin blanket wrapped around her legs, her hands cradling a worn paperback. Claire's hair had thinned, but her eyes still carried a spark that made people forget how fragile she looked. Her IV stand clicked gently with every move she made, but she ignored it, turning the page of The Little Prince like it was the first time, though the corners were bent from rereading. Nurse Maribel stepped in with a clipboard, her curly hair tied back and her smile as warm as ever. "Still flying with your prince today?" she asked, easing down beside the bed. Claire nodded. "I like when he meets the fox." Maribel smiled. "That part always made me cry." Claire looked down at the page. "It's not sad, it's just honest." She traced her finger along a line of underlined words. "You become responsible, forever, for what you have tamed." Maribel leaned in. "You've read that book 5 times. If you had one wish, one real one, what would it be?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked at the small stuffed fox that sat on her bedside table. Its orange fur was faded, but its presence was comforting. After a quiet moment, she said, "I'd like to meet Keanu Reeves." Maribel blinked. "Keanu Reeves?" Claire nodded, still looking at the fox. "Not because he's famous, it's just, in every movie he looks like he's carrying something heavy, but he never stops walking." Maribel was silent for a moment, moved more than she expected. "Well," she said, standing, "that's a wish worth mailing." Claire gave a half smile, as if not expecting much, but the thought of trying was enough. That evening, Claire sat at the rolling tray table beside her bed with a blank sheet of paper and a ballpoint pen. Her mom, Emily, folded laundry on the couch across the room, watching her daughter's concentration with a mixture of pride and worry. Claire had written letters before, thank you notes to her doctors, a postcard to her cousin, even one to her favorite author. But this was different. She paused often, tapping the pen gently, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted every word to mean something. When she finally started writing, the words flowed with surprising ease. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I know you probably get a lot of letters from people who admire your work. I'm not writing to talk about your movies, even though I love them. I'm writing because something about the way you act makes me feel like it's okay to be quiet, like it's okay to be carrying something and not explain it to everyone. My name is Claire. I'm 16. I've been at Rosehaven Children's Hospital for a while. They say I'm brave, but really, I'm just trying to hold on. I like your movies because you always look like you're holding on too. I don't want anything big, I just want to meet you. Maybe we could read something together. I like The Little Prince. There's a fox in it that reminds me that love is real, even when you're scared. Thank you for listening. Even if you never read this, it helped to write it." She ended it with her full name and room number, then folded the page and tucked it into an envelope. "Mom?" she said quietly. Emily looked up. "You done?" Claire nodded. "Will you mail this?" Emily read the name on the envelope and raised an eyebrow. "Keanu Reeves?" Claire smiled a little. "Yeah." Emily didn't argue. She just crossed the room, took the letter, and hugged her daughter. "I'll mail it tomorrow," she said, "but don't get your hopes up." Claire didn't, but she still placed her fox beside the envelope as if to bless it before it left. The next morning, true to her word, Emily drove into town, stopped at the little post office by the grocery store, and dropped the letter into the blue box. She stood there for a moment afterward, her hand lingering near the slot. A mother's hope is a strange thing, at once fierce and hesitant. She didn't believe anything would come of it, but something about the way Claire had written made her wonder. Back at the hospital, Claire wasn't waiting for a response. She was rereading chapter 21, the Foxes chapter, when Maribel came in to check her vitals. "No fever today," she said cheerfully, "and your white counts are stable." Claire nodded, her eyes still on the book. "That's good." Maribel glanced at the fox plush beside her. "He's still watching over you?" Claire smiled softly. "Always." Across the country, 3 days later, in the back of a quiet film trailer parked on the edge of a canyon set in New Mexico, a production assistant dropped a small bundle of fan mail on the counter. Most of it would be sorted by the team, but one envelope caught the assistant's eye. No agent name, no PR address, just a neat return label and a note scrawled in blue pen. Room 207, Rosehaven Children's Hospital. He placed it on top of the pile. Later that night, Keanu returned to the trailer after wrapping a night scene. He peeled off his jacket, poured himself tea, and began flipping through the letters. A few sentences into Claire's note, he stopped. He didn't rush. He read the entire letter once, then again. Then he looked out the window for a long time, his hand resting lightly on the paper, and whispered to no one in particular. The next morning, Keanu Reeves sat in the far corner of his trailer, still in costume, boots unlaced, a black t-shirt clinging to his back after a long night shoot. The desert winds outside tapped against the aluminum walls, but he barely noticed. In his hands, he held the letter again. Claire's handwriting was neat, almost careful, as if every word had to be earned. He had read it 3 times already, and each time it slowed him down. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It wasn't even sad in the way most letters like this could be. It was something else. Gentle, steady, brave. He read the same sentence again. "I like your movies because you always look like you're holding on to." He exhaled through his nose. That line had stuck with him. It wasn't the kind of thing someone says lightly. Outside the trailer, someone knocked and called for him. "Mr. Reeves, we're ready for your scene." Keanu didn't answer immediately. He folded the letter, placed it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, and stood. "Give me 10. He shot the scene. It was quick, a final monologue on a cliff edge, his character letting go of a past he never fully escaped. The moment the director called cut, Keanu didn't linger. He pulled his coat back on, grabbed his duffel, and walked toward the car. He called his assistant as he crossed the lot. "I need a flight to Portland," he said. "Quietly. Today, if possible." The assistant hesitated. "For press?" "No, just me." A pause. Then, "Got it." That night, while most of the crew celebrated the wrap party, Keanu sat in a quiet hotel room with a cup of tea and a laptop. He searched for the hospital, Rosehaven Children's Hospital, and found a photo of it in winter. Red bricks, wide windows, and snow-covered trees in the courtyard. The kind of place that tried to be more than clinical. Then he found a bookstore 5 blocks from the hotel. The next morning, after a short walk through a foggy Portland street, he stepped inside. The shop was quiet. Rows of hardcovers lined the walls like they were standing at attention. A bell chimed above him, and the older woman at the counter looked up in quiet surprise, but said nothing. He made his way to the children's section and found it The Little Prince in hardcover, cream-colored with gold trim. He flipped to chapter 21 and paused at the fox. "You become responsible, forever, for what you have tamed." And he didn't smile. He just nodded. Then he took the book to the counter, paid in cash, and walked out. Back at Rosehaven, the air smelled faintly of peppermint and sanitizer. Claire was curled beneath her blanket, the fox plush tucked near her elbow, her eyes closed but not asleep. Her mother sat by the window, reading, occasionally glancing over to make sure Claire's chest rose and fell in its usual rhythm. Maribel knocked once and peeked in. "Morning, Claire Bear." Claire stirred and smiled faintly. "Hey, you feel up to a visitor today?" Claire blinked. Visitor? Maribel gave a playful shrug. Someone special, not saying who, just, maybe brush your hair? Claire's mother looked up, curious. A musician? Maribel winked and disappeared. Claire didn't ask more. She didn't want to hope. An hour later, the hallway outside room 207 fell unusually quiet. No rolling carts, no laughter from the nurse's station, just a kind of expectant hush. Then the door opened gently. Keanu stepped inside without ceremony. No entourage, no fanfare, just him, holding a small cloth bag in one hand and a hardcover book in the other. Claire looked up and froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then tears welled up, soft, not from shock, but from something deeper, recognition. As if the man from the screen had stepped out not to perform, but to be real. Keanu gave a soft smile, warm but quiet. "Hi, Claire," he said gently. "I heard you love this book." He lifted the little prince slightly. Claire nodded, her voice caught in her chest. Keanu stepped closer, slowly, giving her space. "Would it be okay if we read a little together?" Claire finally managed to speak. "Yes, please." He pulled the chair beside her bed and sat without adjusting it or turning it toward the camera. There was no camera, just presence. He didn't open the book right away. He just sat there with her, letting the moment breathe. Claire stared at the cover. Her hands trembled slightly. "I can't believe you're here," she whispered. "I'm glad I am," he said. "I wanted to come in person. You made me remember something important." Claire tilted her head, curious. "That being seen matters," he said. Then he opened the book to chapter 21 and handed it to her. "You pick the voice, fox or prince." Claire laughed, wiping her cheek. "I'm always the fox. Then I'll follow your lead." And they began to read. They read for nearly an hour, their voices alternating between lines, never rushed. Claire's tone was soft, slow, like someone savoring every syllable. Keanu matched her rhythm, never overpowering, never correcting. It wasn't a performance, it was communion. At times they paused to laugh. When the fox described the importance of rituals, Claire smiled. "I used to pretend I had tea with the nurses at exactly 3 o'clock every day," she said. Keanu looked at her. "Did it help?" Claire nodded. "Made the pain predictable. That's a kind of magic." A nurse peeked through the glass panel in the door but didn't enter. The sight of them, Keanu Reeves reading The Little Prince with a teenage girl in a hospital bed, was something sacred. No one wanted to break it. After they finished the chapter, they sat in silence. Not awkward, not heavy, just still. Keanu leaned back in the chair and let his gaze drift to the small, plush fox beside her pillow. "Is this him?" he asked. Claire nodded. "That's Prince. I've had him since I was 6. Keanu reached into the cloth bag he brought and pulled out a small object. It was a music box, wooden, hand-carved, with a tiny fox etched on top. Claire blinked in wonder. "I made this," he said. "It's not perfect, but I thought maybe Prince needed a song." He turned the key, and a gentle melody filled the room. It wasn't loud, just soft notes that floated like a whisper. Claire clutched the box, eyes wet again. "You made this?" Keanu shrugged. "A hobby." Her hands traced the carved lines. "No one's ever made something like this for me." "You made something for me," he said, tapping the book. "That letter." Claire couldn't speak. She leaned her head back against the pillow, her fingers still turning the box slowly. Keanu remained seated, quiet again, watching the way she listened. Outside the window, clouds began to drift apart, revealing streaks of blue sky for the first time that morning. Claire closed her eyes, the music winding down. "Do you think there's something after?" she asked quietly. Keanu didn't rush to answer. "I don't know," he said after a moment, "but I believe the love we give keeps going." Claire opened her eyes and turned to him. "That's enough," she whispered. And for the rest of the hour they sat in silence, the book between them, the fox nestled close, and the music box, closed, but still warm in her hands. Claire was still smiling when she woke the next morning. The music box sat near her pillow, and the copy of The Little Prince was neatly bookmarked where they had left off. Her mom had barely slept. She kept replaying the previous day in her head, stunned by how natural it had all felt. There had been no performance, no pressure, just a quiet presence that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Then came the knock. Keanu stepped in again, wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans, holding a brown paper bag. "You weren't expecting me again, were you?" he asked gently. Claire blinked, then laughed. "You came back?" "I cleared my schedule," he said. "Today belongs to you." Her mom stood up, startled. "Are you sure you don't have to?" "I want to." He held up the paper bag. "I brought pancake mix," he said. "Think they'll let us use the pediatric kitchen?" 10 minutes later, they were in a corner of the hospital kitchen usually reserved for cooking therapy. Keanu stood by the griddle, apron tied loosely around his waist, flipping pancakes while Claire measured out chocolate chips from a small bowl. Claire's mother stood off to the side, watching them with cautious joy. It had been months since she'd seen Claire so animated. "You ever worked in a diner?" Claire teased. "Nope," Keanu said, grinning as he flipped one with flair. "But I've burned toast in at least 3 countries." They laughed, and the sound spilled into the hallway. A nurse walking past stopped in her tracks. It wasn't the sound of laughter that surprised her. It was who it came from. She peeked through the window and whispered to the nurse beside her, "Is that Keanu Reeves making pancakes?" The other nurse shrugged. "He came yesterday. I thought it was a publicity thing." "No cameras?" "None." The skeptical nurse squinted through the glass. Claire was laughing so hard she had to steady herself on the counter. "Doesn't look staged," she muttered. "Nope, looks like family." She didn't say anything more, but she didn't walk away either. Back in the kitchen, Keanu flipped another pancake, this one slightly misshapen. Claire giggled. "That one's me, crooked but holding it together." Keanu handed her the plate. "Then I guess this one's mine." Claire bit into hers. "Perfect." Keanu smiled. "Yours is better." They spent another hour together in the kitchen, washing dishes, talking about syrup preferences and movie bloopers. Keanu asked about her favorite songs, and when she named an old folk track from the 70s, he raised an eyebrow. "Good taste," he said. "You thought I'd say Taylor Swift?" "I was hoping for Bowie," he teased. Claire laughed again. "Close enough." After lunch, Keanu helped push Claire's wheelchair to the hospital courtyard. The staff had arranged for her to get some fresh air, and the clouds had finally given way to pale blue sky. The chill in the air was gentle, not biting, and Claire had a soft blanket over her legs and a knit cap over her head. The fox plush rested in her lap. They settled near a bench surrounded by a low hedge of sleeping rose bushes. Keanu reached into his bag again and pulled out a small travel guitar. Claire's eyes widened. "You play?" "A little." He sat on the edge of the bench, adjusted the tuning with careful hands, and began strumming quietly. Nothing flashy, just a soft melody that seemed to hum with the wind. Claire closed her eyes. "What's it called?" she asked. "Didn't name it," he replied. "It just fits." She rested her head back. Her breath was steady, slower now. Her mother sat nearby, silent, watching the way Keanu's presence never pushed, only offered. When the song ended, Claire didn't open her eyes right away. Then, slowly, she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What's something people get wrong about you?" Keanu thought for a long moment. "That I've figured it all out." Claire turned her head toward him, eyes open now, studying him. "And you haven't?" "No one has. We just learn how to carry the questions better." Claire nodded, understanding that more deeply than most people her age ever would. "My turn?" he asked gently. She smiled. "Go ahead. What's something you wish people understood about you?" Claire's answer didn't come right away. Her eyes wandered across the courtyard, following a bird perched on the fence. "I don't want to be remembered as the girl who was sick." Her voice was clear, though soft. "I want to be remembered as someone who loved big, even when it hurt." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. Claire looked down at her fox. "I write letters sometimes, to people I've met here, other patients. I leave them in books. I don't sign them, just leave a little light where I can." Keanu's voice was quieter now. "That's more than most people do in a lifetime." From a window on the second floor, the skeptical nurse from earlier stood watching. She'd come to take her break, half expecting the actor to be gone already. But there he was, guitar case at his feet, listening like the world outside that moment didn't exist. When she saw Claire reach over and take his hand, and him simply close his around hers, she pressed her palm against the glass and quietly wiped a tear that had surprised her. As the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the trees, they returned to the room. Claire was tired, her energy waning from the long outing, but she refused to sleep just yet. She didn't want to waste a second. Keanu offered to read again, and she nodded. He picked up The Little Prince, flipping to a random chapter this time, not one they had marked. As he began to read aloud, Claire's head leaned against the pillow. Her eyes closed, but her lips moved silently with the words. Halfway through the page, she whispered, "You sound like my dad used to." Keanu paused. "What was he like?" "He was quiet," she said. "But he always made things feel safe." Keanu nodded and resumed reading. The words floated gently, carried more by presence than performance. Claire drifted in and out of a light sleep, her breathing steady. When he finished the chapter, he looked at her mother, who sat by the window, watching every second with both awe and grief. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He gave a small nod. Later that evening, dinner was served in Claire's room. Nothing fancy, just soup, crackers, and a chocolate pudding cup. Keanu stayed, sitting beside her, offering jokes about hospital cuisine that made her laugh even between spoonfuls. Before he left, he bent slightly, his voice barely audible. "Today was mine too," he said. Claire looked up, sleepy but smiling. "Will you come back?" "I promise." He stood slowly, gave her mother a gentle nod, and stepped into the hallway. Maribel was there, waiting. "You stayed the whole day?" she said, surprised. "Nice, I didn't want to miss it." She looked at him, then back at the door he'd just exited. "I'll be honest. When I heard you were coming, I rolled my eyes." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "But I was wrong," she added quietly. She needed today, and so did the rest of us. Keanu reached into his bag one last time and handed her a folded piece of paper. "She wrote something for someone, no name, said to leave it somewhere." Maribel took the paper. "I'll know where to put it." They said no more. As Keanu walked toward the exit, the sounds of the hospital returned, beeping monitors, squeaky wheels, soft footsteps. But something had changed. For one day, the world had bent itself to Claire's joy. No stage, no script, no spotlight, just kindness. And down the hall, in room 207, the music box played again, its melody soft and slow, as a girl with a fox in her arms drifted off to sleep, holding her perfect day inside her heart. The next morning, Claire stirred before the nurses came in. Her body ached more than usual, but her mind was alert. She watched the early light touch the window and thought about the music box. It had become part of her now, just like Prince, just like the letter she had written and nearly forgotten. A soft knock came at the door. When it opened, Keanu stepped in again, holding something carefully wrapped in a folded cloth. He looked slightly more tired, his hair a little tousled, but his presence was the same, gentle, grounding. "I brought you something," he said, approaching her bed. Claire sat up straighter. "You already gave me a gift." "This one's different." He unfolded the cloth and revealed a second music box, this one slightly larger. On the lid was a tiny hand-carved fox, sitting beneath a single star. Claire gasped. The box was darker wood, polished smooth, and along the edge, carved in small cursive letters, were the words, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." "It plays a different tune," Keanu said. He wound the key once, and the music floated out, a soft lullaby she didn't recognize, but immediately loved. Claire touched the fox with her fingertips. "It's beautiful." He nodded. "I thought your prince needed a friend." Tears welled up in her eyes. Keanu sat down beside her, not saying anything more for a while. Claire turned the box in her hands, inspecting every detail. There was something quiet in the way she handled it, like she understood how much of him was in the grain of the wood. After a while, she reached for the side drawer of her hospital bed and pulled out her own copy of The Little Prince. It was worn, soft-backed, the pages creased and dog-eared. She held it out to him. "I want you to have this," she said. Keanu's brow furrowed gently. "Are you sure?" "It's my favorite thing, but it feels like it belongs with you now." He accepted it slowly, as if receiving something sacred. The book had been annotated with small notes in pencil, sometimes whole sentences in the margins. He flipped to the chapter with the fox and found a line underlined 3 times. "What is essential is invisible to the eye." Next to it, in small, careful print, Claire had written, "But you can still feel it if you try." Keanu ran his finger under the sentence, then looked up. "This is your handwriting?" Claire smiled. "I started adding thoughts when I was 10, just in case someone ever needed them." Keanu flipped through more pages. He paused at one where Claire had drawn a tiny heart beside a paragraph. Her note beside it read, "You don't have to say everything, just stay." He closed the book gently, cradling it in his lap. "I'll take good care of it," he said. Claire nodded, then looked toward the window. Outside, dusk was beginning to color the sky in soft purples and deepening blues. The nurses had dimmed the lights, and a gentle hum from the hallway provided the only background noise. Claire shifted in her bed, reaching for the controls to sit up higher. Keanu helped her adjust the pillow behind her back. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her for a moment, not answering too quickly. "Yes," he said, "but I try not to run from it. I think fear sometimes means we're standing close to something that matters." Claire thought about that. Her fingers rested on the music box again. "I used to be scared of forgetting things," she said. "But now I think I just don't want to be forgotten." "You won't be," he said. She turned toward him. "How do you know?" "Because you've already changed people," he replied. "You changed me." That answer settled something in her. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment. "I like it when people don't talk too much," she murmured. "Sometimes it makes me feel more here." Keanu smiled. "Then let's just sit." He moved his chair closer and turned it toward the window. The stars had begun to appear, just a few, barely visible through the hospital glass. Claire's eyes followed one of them until she couldn't anymore. "I used to think stars were just fire," she whispered. "But now I think they're memories, the kind that shine back when everything else is dark." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Keanu stayed still, letting the moment unfold. Neither spoke. They watched as more stars emerged, quiet and distant. The music box sat between them, unwound but somehow still singing in the air. Claire's breathing slowed. She broke the silence again, voice barely audible. "Do you think there's something after?" Keanu didn't move. He looked at the sky. Then, softly, he answered, "I don't know." He paused, then added, "But I believe the love we give keeps going." Claire closed her eyes again. "Then that's enough." Keanu turned his gaze back to her. "It is." The night deepened. Lights in other hospital rooms flickered off one by one. The hallway grew quiet. The hum of machines softened, and the world outside became a shadow of stillness. But inside room 207, the atmosphere felt alive in a different way. Claire's mother stood just outside the door, watching through the glass. She had stepped out to give them space, but something kept her there. The way Claire rested against Keanu's shoulder, the way he didn't move, didn't perform, just breathed with her. It was like watching someone protect something fragile without needing to fix it. Keanu eventually reached across and pulled the blanket a little higher over Claire's legs. Her breathing was steady but quieter. Not struggling, just tired. "I used to think," she said softly, "that being remembered meant doing something big." "And now?" he asked. "I think it means being loved." He nodded. "That's the biggest thing there is." She smiled faintly, her eyes closed now, voice like a breeze. "You'll remember me?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I already do." She didn't answer, but the smile on her face lingered. They stayed that way for a long time. Claire eventually drifted into sleep, her head still resting against him, the new music box clutched gently in her hands. Keanu didn't move. He listened to her breathing, watched the stars, and let silence be the answer to everything that didn't need words. Later, when her mother stepped inside to check on her, he quietly stood, nodded once, and whispered, "She's amazing." Emily blinked back emotion. "She'll never forget this." He looked down at Claire, then at the Fox music box. "Neither will I." Before he left, he set her copy of The Little Prince gently on the bedside table, next to her original plush fox. The handmade box remained in her hands, its fox curled under the star. He stepped out into the hallway, the soft overhead lights casting long shadows. A nurse nodded at him silently as he passed. Another staff member simply placed a hand on her heart. Keanu didn't respond with words. He just gave a quiet, respectful bow of his head. Outside, the night air was cool but not cold. He looked up, the stars now bright above the hospital roof line. Somewhere behind one of those windows, a girl had fallen asleep with peace in her heart and a fox in her arms. And maybe, Keanu thought, just maybe, that was enough to carry forever. The next morning, Claire was still asleep when Keanu returned. He knocked softly, peeked inside, and saw her curled slightly toward the window, the music box cradled in her hands. Her breathing was slower than the day before, each rise and fall of her chest spaced out like it had to travel farther to return. Her mother sat quietly in the corner, eyes red-rimmed but calm. "She hasn't woken up yet," Emily whispered. "The nurse says, maybe today, maybe not." Keanu nodded. He didn't ask for more. Instead, he walked in with quiet steps, careful not to let his boots squeak against the tile. He placed a folded piece of paper on her bedside table, beside the book she had given him. Then he sat down in the same chair as before. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just stayed. The wind outside had picked up, sending the leaves in the courtyard spinning in slow, wide circles. Sunlight streamed in through the window and rested softly on Claire's face. When the nurse came to check her IV, Keanu stood. He looked at Claire one last time, his hand brushing the edge of the blanket in a gesture that held more gratitude than farewell. He turned to Emily. "She's extraordinary," he said. Emily nodded, unable to speak. Keanu left without ceremony, without waiting for thanks or notice. The folded note he had left behind was simple. No signature. Just a few lines, written with care. "I'll carry this day with me. Thank you for showing me what light looks like in the dark." 3 days later, room 207 was empty. The bed was freshly made, the fox plush rested on the pillow, and the music box sat atop the folded blanket, the carved fox facing the window. Maribel stood at the foot of the bed, the chart in her hand trembling slightly. She had been the one to find her. Claire hadn't stirred all night. There had been no alarms, no final struggle. Just a soft, silent slipping away. Her fingers were still curled around the music box. The melody had stopped, but the memory of it lingered in the stillness. Maribel didn't cry at first. She simply reached over, brushed a strand of hair from the pillow, and whispered, "Goodbye, little fox." She stayed in the room longer than she needed to, unable to leave the silence behind. Later that day, the hospital called the contact number Claire's mother had given them, a private one, requested for a specific purpose. It reached a quiet phone on a wooden table in a dim room. Keanu answered on the first ring. There were no words, just a pause. Then a soft voice said, "She's gone." Keanu closed his eyes. "Thank you for telling me." The funeral was held 4 days later in a small chapel just outside Portland. The service was modest, quiet, just the way Claire would have wanted. No elaborate decorations, just soft music, pale lilies, and a framed photo of her smiling beside the courtyard roses. Her copy of The Little Prince rested beside the frame, its cover worn, the corners curled. The fox plush sat next to it, and behind them the music box rested on a velvet cloth, the star on its lid catching the light. Keanu arrived quietly, alone. He wore a black coat and dark slacks, his familiar cross tucked beneath his shirt, though occasionally the silver chain caught a glint of light when he moved. No cameras followed him. No one announced his name. Most people didn't recognize him. Just another guest in the back row, head bowed, hands clasped gently in front of him. He listened as the chaplain spoke of Claire's spirit, her kindness, her strange, wonderful way of noticing things others missed. Her mother gave a short eulogy, her voice shaking but firm. She didn't ask for fame or miracles, Emily said. She asked for presence, and somehow she got it. There was a small reception afterward, cookies and tea set out in the adjacent room. Keanu didn't go inside. Instead, he stepped out into the small garden behind the chapel, where a few chairs had been set up for those needing air. He carried a single flower in his hand. White, delicate, its petals shaped like the narrow ears of a fox. A florist friend had made it for him. It wasn't flashy, just meaningful. He waited until most had gone. Then he stepped quietly to the casket before it was closed. He knelt beside it. For a long time he said nothing. Then, almost inaudibly, he whispered, "Thank you for letting me meet you." He placed the fox-shaped flower gently on the satin lining. His fingers lingered for just a moment. Then he stood, stepped back, and nodded to the funeral director. No speech, no farewell, just stillness. As the casket was carried out to the hearse, the wind picked up again. One of the musicians from the chapel, an older man with a violin, began to play softly, an unplanned piece, a melody not written but felt. Keanu stayed until the very end. He didn't introduce himself, didn't wait for anyone to approach. When it was over, he walked slowly to his car, hands in his coat pockets, eyes lowered. Behind him, the music faded, but the memory stayed. A few days after the funeral, Claire's mother received a small package in the mail. There was no return address, just her name written in careful script. Inside was a single item. Claire's worn copy of The Little Prince, now fitted with a protective leather cover. Inside the front flap was a handwritten note. "I promised I'd take good care of it, but I think it belongs with the person who gave her the courage to love big. With deepest respect." Tucked inside the back cover was a pressed white foxglove, real, delicate, the kind of flower that could never survive without attention. Her mother held it in her hands for a long time before closing the book and placing it on the mantel beside Claire's photo. Elsewhere, Keanu sat alone in his Los Angeles home, the first rain of the season tapping gently against the windows. In front of him sat a candle, its flame quiet, steady. The same music box rested nearby. He had made a replica, nearly identical to the one Claire held when she passed. He didn't light incense or say a prayer aloud, but he closed his eyes and for a while just listened. To the silence, to the music inside his memory, to the echo of a girl who taught him more about grace in 2 days than most people do in a lifetime. In the weeks that followed, he said nothing publicly. No interviews, no quotes, no photos. But those who knew him noticed a shift, a new stillness, even for someone already known for his quiet. He began visiting children's hospitals more often, never announced, never documented. He left behind music boxes with tiny carvings of foxes. Some he gave directly to patients, Others he handed quietly to staff. None came with his name, and in a notebook by his bed, he began to write. Not a screenplay, not a speech, just fragments. Lines like "love that stays doesn't need to shout," or "she taught me that the stars don't go out. We just forget to look up." Back in Oregon, Maribel stood by room 207, now occupied by a new patient. She had placed a tiny framed photo on the shelf tucked near the window. Claire, laughing, holding a pancake spatula in one hand and a crooked pancake in the other. Beneath it was a simple quote, "Love big, even when it hurts." And just beneath that, etched into the bottom of the music box, now kept in the hospital's memory display case, was the message Keanu had left behind. "Thank you for showing me what light looks like in the dark." The first snow had come early that year. Rose Haven Children's Hospital stood quietly beneath a thin dusting of white. Icicles clung to the roof's edge, and the wind carried the scent of pine and cold. Inside, things moved as usual. Nurses rotated shifts, parents paced quietly beside beds, and soft lullabies played from the pediatric wing. But something new stirred on the second floor. It began with a plaque. Polished wood, mounted just outside a freshly painted door near the end of the hallway. The letters were etched in warm brass. Claire's reading room. In honor of a heart too bright to fade. No fanfare, no press, no ribbon cutting, just a quiet unveiling and a soft whisper of a promise kept. Inside, the room had been transformed. Walls once blank were now wrapped in murals, painted in soft watercolors featuring stars, planets, and a little fox perched beneath a tree. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with stories from around the world. Floor cushions sat in cozy clusters. A rocking chair rested beside a low window, bathed in natural light. There were no beeping machines here, no wires, just warmth. No one at the hospital had known who funded the project, a private donation. The check had arrived with no formal cover letter, just a small card enclosed. To honor someone whose story was too short, but changed everything. Okay. Maribel had been the one to open the card. Her fingers trembled as she read it, and though the initial didn't say everything, it said enough. She had spent days helping arrange the room. She placed books where Claire might have placed them. She set the fox plush near the window, beside a new copy of The Little Prince. It was in that book that she found it. A note, folded and tucked gently between the pages. "She taught me that stories heal, so here's a room full of them." Okay. She closed the book and held it to her chest. Later that afternoon, the hospital director entered the room for the first time. He was a tall, serious man, usually focused on budgets and board meetings, but that day he stood in the doorway, quietly taking it all in. His eyes landed on the framed photograph on the far wall. It showed Claire and Keanu sitting side by the window. She was mid-laugh, holding the fox in her lap. He was reading from her book, head slightly bowed, a small smile on his face. The caption beneath read, "Claire and a friend. Room 207, just before the stars came out." The director didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once, wiped at the corner of his eye, and stepped out into the hallway without a word. Word about the room spread quietly, not through headlines or hospital memos, but through whispers. Nurses telling nurses, parents guiding their children toward the soft glow coming from the doorway. No one called it Claire's room officially in conversation. They called it the quiet place, or the book room, or simply the room with the stars. A little boy named Mateo, who hadn't spoken in 3 days following a difficult diagnosis, wandered in during a therapy break. He didn't say anything, he just sat cross-legged on the fox-mattered rug and opened a picture book about a bear who couldn't sleep. A nurse peeked in minutes later to check on him. He looked up, held a finger to his lips and whispered, "Don't wake the stars." She backed away, eyes stinging. By the end of that week, the hospital had set up a soft-voiced story hour. Volunteers came in once a day to read, but sometimes they didn't have to. Children read to each other, siblings, patients, even staff. One day, Marivelle brought in her own niece and sat her down by the window. "You see that picture?" she asked, pointing to Claire and Keanu. The girl nodded. She was the reason this place exists. "Who's the man?" her niece asked. "Just someone who listened." The girl turned back to her book. "That's a good kind of someone." A week later, a teenage boy recovering from surgery left behind a notebook filled with his own short stories. No signature, just a single sentence scrawled across the cover. For the girl who loved big, even when it hurt. A quiet legacy began to take shape. The hospital didn't advertise the reading room. There were no flyers, no social media posts, but more and more families found themselves drifting toward it. Parents with anxious children, kids who couldn't sleep, teens who needed to feel like they still mattered beyond the tubes and monitors. Inside the room, time slowed. The music box Claire once held sat on a shelf near the window. It had been restored and sealed in a protective case, but it still worked. Occasionally, someone would turn the key, and the melody would fill the space. Not loud, just enough to remind everyone that quiet things could be powerful too. One evening, as snow fell again outside, a child left a drawing on the windowsill, a fox sitting under a sky full of stars. Next to it, in shaky letters, they wrote, "Stories stay." And they did. Late one evening, long after visiting hours had ended, a janitor doing his final rounds passed by the reading room. The lights inside were dimmed, but he paused anyway. Something about that room always made him slow down, like stepping into it might break something sacred. He peeked through the glass. There, sitting on the rug with her legs crossed, was a nurse named Layla. She'd had a long day, 3 patient losses in 2 weeks, and a mother who hadn't stopped crying for 9 straight hours. But here, in the hush of stars and painted foxes, she was reading out loud. To no one, or maybe to someone. The janitor didn't interrupt. He simply watched for a moment, nodded to himself, and moved on. The next morning, tucked beneath the framed photo of Claire and Keanu, a new note appeared. No one knew who wrote it. It was printed neatly on a small square of paper and taped just below the image. Sometimes we meet people for one day and they stay with us for every day after. That quote remained there. It didn't need to be attributed. Everyone who read it seemed to know exactly who it was about. Weeks turned into months. The snow melted. Spring returned. Outside the hospital, people came and went with busy footsteps and louder days. But inside Claire's reading room, the pace never changed. Children still came to sit on cushions and read under stars. New books appeared quietly. Old ones disappeared, only to reappear with crayon marks and folded pages that meant they'd been loved. And once a month, without fail, a fresh white flower shaped like a fox would be found tucked into the shelf beside the little prince. No one saw who left it, but the staff stopped asking, because some promises once made don't need to be explained, they just need to be kept. One summer evening, a new family arrived at the hospital. Their daughter had just been admitted, pale and scared, her arms full of wires. The mother, overwhelmed and tearful, asked the front desk nurse if there was anywhere quiet they could go just to breathe. The nurse smiled softly. "I know the perfect place." She led them upstairs, down the hallway to the reading room, and opened the door. The child stepped inside, her eyes lit up. And on the wall, in the quiet glow of the setting sun, she saw a girl with a fox and a man with a book, smiling, laughing, reading. And without knowing a thing, she whispered, "She looks like someone who believed in magic." It started with a single sticky note, pale yellow, slightly curled at the edges, left on the edge of the bookshelf closest to the door. It read, "I didn't like books until I saw her picture. Now I read to the fox every morning." Jaden, age 7. No one saw him put it there. He had slipped in with his older sister, both quiet and small. She came for treatment. He came for somewhere to hide from the beeping and the grown-up whispers. The fox in the window made him stay. The note stayed where it was. By the next morning, there were 3 more. a crayon drawing of stars and a girl in a wheelchair with a crown. A tiny folded paper crane with a message inside. She's not gone. She just lives here now. And a printed letter from a teenager that read, "When I feel scared, I sit where she sat. It helps." The hospital staff noticed, but no one removed them. Instead, someone quietly tacked up a corkboard near the door, left a small container of pins, and said nothing. The wall began to grow. Notes came in every color. Drawings of foxes, of stars, of trees with doors that opened into libraries, messages in broken English, notes written by parents on behalf of toddlers, stick figure portraits labeled "Me plus her plus peace." One afternoon, a nurse entered the room after her shift and sat by the window with a cup of tea. She stared at the wall, eyes drawn to a message scrawled in shaky pencil. "You made it okay to be quiet." She sat with that one for a long time. Months passed. The reading room never changed in loud ways, but it deepened in quiet ones. Children no longer needed to be told where it was. They found it. Parents, too. Volunteers began spending time in the room just to feel something softer than the world outside. And then one day, without announcement, he returned. It was early morning, just after sunrise. The hospital was quiet. Most staff hadn't arrived yet. But the janitor was finishing his rounds, pushing his cart softly down the second-floor hallway, when he saw a figure seated in the corner of the reading room. He paused, stepped back, and looked again. Keanu sat alone in the rocking chair near the window. The music box on the shelf remained untouched. His hands were folded in his lap, his head bowed, not in grief, not in prayer, just stillness. He didn't open a book, didn't take a note from the wall, didn't speak. He just sat there, breathing. The janitor stood just outside the door, unsure whether to announce himself. But something about the scene told him not to. It wasn't a visit, it was a return. Keanu didn't notice him. Or maybe he did, but chose not to acknowledge it. He sat with the same quiet reverence someone might show in a chapel or a gravesite, or a place where something once bloomed and now lived only in memory. The fox plush was still there, the book still rested near the window, the new cover worn slightly at the edges now. And the wall behind him, once bare, had become a tapestry of voices. Keanu glanced up once and scanned the notes. His eyes lingered on a purple sticky note near the bottom right corner. "When I couldn't speak, I read, and when I couldn't read, I just sat in her room." He exhaled softly, not quite a sigh, more like the weight of something shifting from his chest into the air, a kind of surrender. He stood slowly, stepped over to the wall and read a few more notes, touching nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He pinned it at the center of the wall, just above Claire's framed photo. The handwriting was small, neat. "You showed me that silence isn't empty. It's where love lives after sound fades." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Then, with one final look around the room, at the drawings, the books, the soft cushions beneath the painted stars, he turned and walked out. By the time the janitor stepped into the room, Keanu was already down the hallway, heading toward the stairwell instead of the elevators. The janitor didn't chase him. He just stood in the middle of the reading room, hands in his pockets, staring at the newest note on the wall. He didn't remove it. No one would. The wall, in fact, would never be cleared again. Eventually, someone framed it. Over time, the reading room became part of the hospital's culture, not just a feature, but a symbol. Staff began calling it the heart room. Patients referred to it as Claire's place, even if they didn't know who she was. Every child who left a note was given a small bookmark shaped like a fox. No one said where they came from. But they always arrived, tucked into books, left at the front desk, or slipped into mail slots late at night. No logo, no credit. Just a quiet promise, still being kept. One day, years later, a young woman walked into Claire's reading room with her child. She hadn't been to the hospital since she was a patient herself, but she remembered every inch of the second floor, She hadn't planned to come back. But when her daughter was born prematurely and they were transferred here for specialized care, something inside her told her to find the room again. She opened the door and was surprised to find it almost exactly as she remembered. The fox still sat near the window. The mural still wrapped across the walls. The books were newer now, but the soul of the place hadn't changed. Her daughter toddled inside and went straight to the wall of notes. "Who wrote all these?" the little girl asked. The woman smiled. "People who needed to feel something real." "Can I write one?" She nodded. The girl scribbled something in block letters and pinned it near the bottom corner. When the mother leaned in to read it, her breath caught in her throat. "Thank you for the room where my mommy stopped being scared." She didn't say anything, just placed her hand gently on her heart and sat by the window, the same way she had when she was 15 and had just found out her diagnosis. The room held them. Later that evening, the cleaning crew came through again. One paused, noticing the new note. He didn't remove it, he just read it, smiled, and moved on. Because by now, everyone knew what this room was. It wasn't a library. It wasn't a memorial. It was a whisper, a soft hum, a place where the loudest sound was stillness. One of the hospital directors, during a meeting with new staff, once pointed to a photo of the reading room during orientation. He didn't explain who Claire was. He didn't mention the actor who helped build it. He just said, "This is where we remember how to care." That was enough. And even now, after all this time, the Fox music box still worked. If you turned the key slowly, it played a tune that didn't demand attention. It just lingered. And above the shelf, pinned beneath the original framed photo, one note remained exactly where it had always been. "You showed me that silence isn't empty. It's where love lives after sound fades." No one ever moved it. Some people read it and cried. Some people just sat in front of it, hand resting over their chest. And in the quiet, in the space between pages and tears, between foxes and stars, Claire lived. It had been 6 months since the funeral when Emily finally sat down to write. She hadn't planned on it. The grief had settled into something quieter by then, not gone, but no longer sharp. There were days when she didn't cry, days when she could open Claire's bedroom door without feeling the wind knocked out of her. But the letter, it had been living inside her from the moment she saw him walk out of the hospital without ever once asking for anything. She didn't want it to be a tribute. She didn't want it to be about Keanu Reeves, the actor. She wanted it to be about a man who sat in silence with a dying girl, who brought her pancakes, who played guitar not for applause, but because it soothed the space between beeps and blood tests. She opened her laptop, found an old photo of Claire sitting beside the music box, and placed it gently beside her screen. Then she wrote, "My daughter's name was Claire. She was 16 when she died, but she lived with more grace than most people ever find in a lifetime. This isn't a letter about grief, it's about gratitude. Because someone gave my daughter something that can't be measured. Not with cameras, not with awards, not even with words, really. He showed up. Not with a publicist or a camera crew, not with scripted words. He walked into her hospital room holding a copy of The Little Prince and asked if he could read to her. He cooked with us, he made her laugh, he listened. He gave her back a piece of something cancer had taken. Normalcy. He wasn't there as a star. He was there as a human being, as a friend." She paused, staring at the blinking cursor, unsure if she should continue. Then she kept going. When Claire fell asleep and never woke up, he left her a note. No signature, just love. And then he came back, for her funeral. He brought a flower shaped like a fox. He didn't sit in the front row, he stood in the back, and he cried with the rest of us. Months later, a reading room appeared in her name. Bookshelves, stars, murals, and a music box that still plays. We never knew who funded it. But we didn't need to. We already knew. She reread the draft twice, edited nothing, and finally hit post. It went up as a blog entry first, a quiet piece titled, "The Day a Stranger Became My Daughter's Friend." She expected maybe 10 people to read it. By the end of the night, it had been shared over 70,000 times. By the second morning, national news outlets had picked it up, not as clickbait, but as something rare, something sacred. Headlines didn't scream, they whispered. A mother's gratitude, a star's quiet grace. Emily's inbox was flooded with thousands of comments, messages, and letters. Most weren't about Keanu at all. They were about daughters, sons, fathers, people who had passed quietly, people who were remembered loudly. One woman wrote, "My son died at 9. No celebrity came, but your story helped me remember how much love surrounded him in those last days. Thank you for reminding me." Another message came from a nurse in Texas. "I've watched patients pass for 20 years, but I've never seen someone describe it with this kind of peace. Your words helped me find mine again." And then there were messages about Keanu. A woman who worked the overnight shift at a children's hospital in Michigan wrote, "He once came in at 3 a.m. with coffee for our entire staff, no cameras, just said thank you for what we do." A father wrote, "My son met him once in a bookstore. He didn't say he was sick, but Keanu sat with him for 15 minutes reading. My boy still talks about it." These stories weren't tabloid fodder. They were testimonials, not to fame, but to something deeper, present. Keanu didn't post about the letter. He didn't respond with a quote or public acknowledgement, but those close to him said he read it in the same way he'd once read The Little Prince to Claire. Slowly, quietly, without rushing through the parts that hurt. Meanwhile, the reading room began to receive new visitors, strangers who had read the blog and traveled miles just to sit in that space. Some brought books to donate. Others just left notes. Many stayed silent. Hospitals across the country began asking about how to replicate the space, not in architecture, but in intention. One administrator in Chicago wrote, "How do we build a room like that? We don't want to brand it. We don't want a plaque with our hospital's name. We just want to create what you described, a place where love lives after sound fades." Emily responded to every message she could, not with long replies, just with honesty. Make it quiet, make it warm. Don't advertise it, just let it be. That became her mantra. The story kept spreading, not in waves, but in pulses. A classroom in Vermont made Fox bookmarks and sent them to the hospital. A small bookshop in Ohio started a Claire's Corner, giving one free book per week to any child who came in with a story to tell. And through it all, the letter remained untouched. No edits, no revisions. Because some truths, once spoken, don't need polishing. One morning, Emily received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a comment or a DM. A real letter, sealed with a wax stamp, addressed in handwriting that reminded her of something old-fashioned and careful. Inside was a card with a single sentence. "Thank you for giving the world a story it didn't know it needed." No signature, but tucked into the envelope was a small pressed foxglove flower. White, delicate, and nearly identical to the one Keanu had left on Claire's casket. She didn't need to guess who it was from. She placed it on the shelf beside Claire's photo and whispered, "She would have said thank you." Later that day, she opened her laptop again and wrote a short follow-up post. It wasn't a continuation of the first letter. It was a message to everyone who had written back. "Grief," she wrote, "isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a room filled with books and silence. Sometimes it's a photo on a wall. Sometimes it's a man sitting quietly beside your child, doing nothing more than breathing with her. What Keanu gave us wasn't charity, it wasn't pity. It was presence, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that just stays." She ended the post with a single sentence. "Please, if you've lost someone, tell their story. They still matter." That sentence took off more than anything else she'd shared. People across the world began posting their own stories, each ending with, "They still matter." Photos flooded the comment section, of shoes left by bedsides, of letters from siblings, of favorite meals cooked in memory. It became a quiet digital vigil, not filled with sadness, but light. Some included photos of small foxes drawn by children. Some wrote, "For Claire." Others simply said, "For someone I miss." Through all this, Emily never once tried to guide the story. She didn't do interviews. She turned down offers to speak at events. When a major publisher reached out about a book deal, she declined. Because for her, the story had already been written. It lived in the note pinned beneath Claire's photo. It lived in the quiet breath of a man who never asked to be praised. It lived in a room filled with stars, with children, with crayons and foxes and folded paper hearts. And maybe most of all, it lived in the letters. Letters from parents, from patients, from strangers who now believed something soft could still be strong. The wall kept growing, and in every word, shared, whispered, or pinned, Claire was remembered. She still mattered. The interview was scheduled for a late afternoon slot. Low-key, not live, meant for a reflective segment on a well-known arts and culture show. The host was gentle, known for drawing out quiet truths rather than tabloid soundbites. Keanu had agreed months ago, long before Claire's story became public, and now it lingered silently behind every question they didn't ask. The studio was lit warmly, the backdrop soft, muted. Not a press junket, not a blockbuster promotion, just 2 chairs and space for a conversation. About halfway through the interview, after discussing his latest film and his motorcycle foundation, the host shifted in her seat, hesitating. "There's something I wanted to ask," she said carefully, "only if it's all right with you." Keanu looked up, nodding. "It's about Claire." He was quiet for a long moment. The host didn't push. Finally, Keanu took a breath. "She reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he said softly. "That joy doesn't wait for perfect." The room seemed to settle into a different rhythm. The cameras didn't zoom, the lights didn't flicker. Just stillness. She didn't ask for anything big. She didn't want Disneyland or a movie set. She wanted pancakes, a book, a little time with someone who would listen. He smiled faintly. "She made the best pancakes I've ever had." The host smiled with him, her eyes glistening. "Why do you think she reached out to you?" she asked gently. "I don't know," he replied, honest. "But I think maybe she saw something in the characters I play. People who carry pain, people who keep walking. And maybe she thought I'd understand what it meant to be tired, but still kind." The camera caught the shift in his expression. Not performance, present. The host asked, "What do you remember most about her?" He looked down at his hands for a moment, then answered. She laughed like someone who knew how precious laughter was, like she didn't want to waste a single one. Then he went silent again, but the moment didn't feel empty. As he spoke, a montage quietly played across the screen. Keanu helping a child read at a hospital in New York. Tying a scarf for an elderly woman outside a grocery store in Toronto, smiling as she insisted he didn't need to help. Sitting silently with a grieving father on a hospital bench in Texas. No words exchanged, just hands folded, shoulders touching. Each clip without music, just life. When the montage faded, the host leaned forward. "Do you think she changed you?" He nodded once. "Yeah, she reminded me that love doesn't always need a speech. Sometimes, just showing up is the whole point." The host let the silence stretch a little longer, giving his words space to breathe. She glanced down at her notes, then gently set them aside. "I think people forget how much showing up matters," she said softly. "Especially when nothing can be fixed." Keanu nodded. "It's something Claire taught me just by being herself. She didn't need you to fix anything. She just needed someone to sit next to her and not look away." A quiet beat passed. Then the host asked, "Did you ever hear from her family after?" Keanu exhaled slowly. "Her mom wrote something, a letter. I read it a few times. I never reached out. I didn't want to make it about me, but I kept a copy of that letter in my guitar case. He smiled to himself. It's folded up in the same place I used to keep lyrics. The host blinked, moved. May I ask, do you go back to the hospital? Keanu paused, then nodded. Yeah, quietly. I don't sign the guest book. I don't ask anyone to walk me in. I just sit in the room. Sometimes I read, sometimes I just breathe. And the wall? It's still there, he said. I don't leave notes anymore, not unless I really need to. But I read the ones the kids leave. Some of them don't even know who Claire was. But they know what that room feels like. He rubbed his hands together, not nervously, just thoughtfully. There was one note that said, "This is where I go when I miss someone." And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. The host let out a breath, slow and quiet. This is more than I thought we'd talk about today. Keanu looked over at her, warm but steady. Sometimes the best conversations aren't planned. She gave a small nod, then asked the final question of the segment. If you could say one more thing to Claire, what would it be? His jaw tightened slightly, but only for a second. Then he smiled. Not the kind for cameras, but the kind that wraps itself around memory. I'd say, I still hear you, and the fox is safe. The host reached for a tissue off camera, laughing gently through her tears. You know, I think she would have liked that. Keanu looked down, then back up. She would have loved this part, he said. The part where people stop talking and just feel. And with that, the segment ended. Not with applause, not with a punchline, but with silence. Not awkward, just full. A kind of reverence, a kind of truth. The interview aired 3 nights later. It wasn't heavily promoted, no headlines teased it, no previews gave away the moment. But somehow it spread faster than any trailer or late-night appearance ever could. Clips flooded social media within hours, not of Keanu's answers, but of the silences, the pauses, the stillness in his face when he talked about Claire, the softness in his voice when he mentioned pancakes, the quiet power of someone remembering without performance. And the quote that made its way into captions across thousands of posts was the simplest one. She made the best pancakes I've ever had. It became a refrain. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards in classrooms. Parents whispered it at the breakfast table. Nurses pinned it to their lockers. Because everyone understood that he wasn't just talking about food. He was talking about presence, about the sacredness of an ordinary moment made unforgettable by love. The network received more letters than any segment in its history. Not fan mail. Letters from viewers who had lost someone, who had never spoken their name out loud in years, who wrote, "Watching that interview gave me permission to remember." Hospitals began airing the segment in pediatric waiting rooms. One children's clinic in Montana posted a photo. A group of kids, all in pajamas, seated in front of a mounted screen, watching Keanu speak. No one fidgeted. No one looked away. One child held a fox plush in her lap. The photo was captioned, "They didn't know his name, but they knew he meant it." Back at the hospital in Oregon, the reading room received another letter. Handwritten, no address. Inside was a message on simple white paper. "Thank you for letting her matter out loud." The director framed it and placed it near the entrance, beside the original plaque. And somewhere, in a small studio apartment in Los Angeles, Keanu sat with the remote in his hand, watching the interview replay quietly on a loop. He didn't fast forward. He didn't rewind. He just let it play. When it reached the part where he said, "She reminded me that joy doesn't wait for perfect," he leaned back and closed his eyes. And when the screen faded to black, he reached for the music box on his shelf and turned the key once. The melody played, soft, gentle, cool. Then he set it down beside a worn copy of The Little Prince and sat there in the quiet. Not mourning, just remembering. Because some interviews aren't meant to promote. They're meant to preserve, to hold space for a voice that once whispered, "I just want to be remembered as someone who loved big." And she was, by everyone who heard the silence and stayed. The book arrived quietly, hand-delivered in a sealed glass case by the hospital's head of family services. No announcement was made, no ribbon was cut. A single card taped to the front simply read. She underlined the parts that made her feel less alone. Maybe they'll help someone else too. It was Claire's personal copy of The Little Prince, the one she had read and reread even in her weakest hours. The pages were creased, the corners curled. On nearly every page she had written notes in the margins, sometimes in neat cursive, sometimes in shaky print from hospital beds. Always in pencil, always in her voice. The hospital debated whether to display it behind glass, but ultimately they placed it in the reading room, in a small wooden case with a liftable lid. A tiny velvet pillow kept the spine open to a different page each day, changed by hand. The first page shown featured a single sentence underlined in soft gray. Calm sees clearly only with the heart. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Beneath it, in Claire's own handwriting. Maybe that's why the world misses so many good people. They're too essential to be seen. The room shifted after that. People who came in to sit with their children now hovered by the book. Some didn't touch it. Some leaned in close. Some cried silently and walked out. But others began to respond. The first sticky note appeared 3 days after the book was placed. A pale pink square, tucked beside the edge of the page. You're not forgotten. None of us are. Then came a blue one. I never believed I mattered. Now I do. Then yellow. Thank you for reminding me that being soft doesn't mean being weak. The notes multiplied quietly, like blossoms after a long winter. They were never removed. Instead, the hospital placed a small tray of sticky notes and pencils on a nearby shelf. No instructions, just there. And people rose. A teenager battling leukemia added a full paragraph next to a page where Claire had circled the line, "It is the time you have wasted for your rose that makes your rose so important." He wrote, "I thought no one cared how long I stayed here, but now I think maybe someone does." A grandmother whose grandson had passed months before left a note that simply said, "I came here because I missed him. I stayed because she reminded me what he used to believe, that love doesn't disappear." The book became something more than a story. It became a conversation. Claire's handwriting had a rhythm to it, curved, open letters when she was strong, tighter, slanted script on the days when the pain was harder to hide. Visitors began to notice the pattern. Some would trace the letters softly with their fingers, like feeling the echo of her presence. A nurse once walked into the reading room on her break and found a mother standing beside the book, eyes closed, holding her child's hand. "She wrote like she was holding someone's heart," the woman whispered, not realizing anyone was listening. The nurse didn't respond. She didn't need to. That moment said enough. One day, a boy around 12 left a full page of thoughts folded inside the book. No name, just words scrawled in blocky letters. "My dad says boys don't cry, but I do. I cried reading this, and I'm not sorry." Another time, a teenage girl left a small paper heart that read, "Thank you for leaving space for the ones who feel too much." Teachers began bringing students into the room on field trips, not to study medicine, but to study empathy. To sit in a space where feelings weren't a liability. To write something that might be read by someone they'd never meet. The book changed with the seasons. In winter, kids drew stars and foxes with scarves, mimicking Claire's favorite margin doodles. In spring, tiny pressed flowers began to appear between pages, left carefully, never crumpled. By summer, the book was so filled with annotations, post-its, and tucked-away notes that it resembled a living scrapbook. A rotating volunteer named Evelyn started collecting the loose messages, pressing and preserving them in scrapbooks that the hospital stored in a small cabinet nearby. When the first volume was complete, she left a note on its cover. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper someone else dares to answer. One page in the original book became especially beloved. It was a passage Claire had circled twice. The fox's farewell. You become responsible, forever, for what you have tamed. Beside it, she had written, "And that's why love stays, even when people go." Visitors began leaving small drawings of foxes near that page. Some left names beside them, others left initials, or just silence in the form of a single mark. An X, a swirl, a line, a breath. That page became sacred. Volunteers began opening the book to it on especially hard days. Nurses brought in parents who had just lost a child. Doctors sat beside it after delivering difficult news. It became a place to break and a place to begin again. On the book's final page, Claire had left only one thing. No sentence circled, no underlined phrase, no paragraph dissected. Just a small drawing. A fox curled beneath a star. No words beside it, just space. The hospital staff didn't alter it. They left that final page open on the anniversary of her passing each year. Visitors would enter and pause, not just because of what was drawn, but because of what wasn't. It was as if Claire had known not everything needed to be said, that some things could be felt without explanation. A child once asked a volunteer what the drawing meant. The volunteer knelt beside her and said, "It means someone you've never met is still giving you peace." That child sat in front of the book for nearly an hour. When she stood, she added a single note in orange crayon. "I'll find the fox someday," and quietly left. The book never became an artifact. It remained a living memory, touched, honored, even wept over. One night, as snow fell outside the window, a former patient, now in remission, came back with her younger brother. She knelt beside the book and whispered. She made the dark feel like home, then left a tiny flashlight beside the case. Staff kept it charged and never moved it. It became part of the room, just like the book, the wall, the fox, and the silence. Eventually, the hospital created a digital replica of Claire's copy of The Little Prince. Families who couldn't travel could now read her notes online and leave messages in the margins. Virtual post-its visible to others around the world. Within a month, there were thousands. A father in Ireland wrote, "My daughter passed last year. Claire's book made me sit down and read with my son again." A girl in Tokyo wrote, "I've never seen snow, but this book feels like what I think snow would sound like." And an elderly woman from Alabama posted, "I never told anyone I was scared to die, but Claire's fox made me feel less alone." These weren't comments. They were confessions. The digital book mirrored the one in the room. Page by page, post-it by post-it, but still the original remained untouched in its case, turned by hand every morning. And every year, on the anniversary of Claire's passing, the final page was shown again. The fox, the star, and the silence between them. No narration played, no voiceover read from a script. Just a single still image that lingered on screen longer than most would expect. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made it matter. Because sometimes, the most powerful legacy isn't what we say. It's what we leave behind in the margins. It was the first week of March, and the sky held the kind of gray that didn't promise rain, only stillness. Outside the Children's Hospital in Oregon, soft lights flickered across the courtyard. Not bright, not loud, just enough to draw people gently in. The staff had planned it quietly, no press release, no flyers, no speeches. Just an email sent to families who had once walked the hallways, patients who could return, nurses and volunteers who remembered, and a few people who simply asked if they could sit in silence and remember with them. The invitation had only one sentence beneath the time and date: to honor the light that never left. They called it a gathering, not a ceremony. And it was. There were no microphones, no music blaring from speakers, just the warmth of battery-operated candles placed in circles around the benches, and a few lanterns held by children who were old enough to walk, but still carried in their bones the quiet knowledge of hard things. The reading room remained open, softly lit. A sign on the door read, "The book is open to the last page tonight." Visitors flowed in and out, never crowding, never rushing. Parents knelt beside their children to trace the fox on the final page. Some left drawings tucked beside it. Others simply placed their hands over their hearts and walked back into the chill evening air. And then, at exactly 7 o'clock, a nurse stepped forward with a copy of The Little Prince in her hands and began to read. Her voice was soft, unhurried. One by one, others took turns. A volunteer, a mother, a teenager who had grown taller since his last visit, a boy in remission who read 2 full pages without stumbling, holding the book with careful hands. Each one read from a different passage. No one tried to summarize. No one needed to explain why they had chosen the words they did. The crowd grew slowly. People stood close but respectfully apart. Some lit candles. Some simply closed their eyes. And at the edge of it all, tucked behind the last row of benches, stood a man in a simple black hoodie, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. He didn't speak. He didn't draw attention. But a few recognized him anyway. A volunteer whispered to another. A nurse paused mid-step and simply nodded once. They didn't rush him. They didn't break the quiet. They just let him be. As the last passage was read, "You risk tears if you let yourself be tamed." A little girl stepped forward, maybe 6 or 7 years old, holding a single yellow daffodil. She walked straight to the man in the hoodie, looked up, and said, "Claire said you liked foxes." Keanu knelt, gently took the flower, and smiled. "I do now," he said. The little girl stood with him for a moment longer, watching his face the way children sometimes do when they're still deciding what's real. Then, without another word, she placed a tiny folded note into his hand and skipped back toward her parents. Keanu opened it later, when no one was looking. It said, in rounded, careful handwriting, "If you're ever sad, remember Claire said foxes don't leave." He folded it once more, tucked it into the pocket near his chest, and stayed exactly where he was. A few moments later, Claire's nurse, the one who had been with her during those last few days, stepped forward. She didn't read, she simply knelt in front of the book's final page, touched the drawing with the tips of her fingers, and whispered something too quiet to hear. Then she lit a single candle and set it on the ground beneath the mural. Others followed. Parents of children who had passed. Patients who had grown strong again. Doctors who never forgot certain names. Volunteers who remembered laughter more than they remembered test results. The candles began forming a ring. Not a vigil, a constellation. No one said what to do, but instinctively people formed a circle around the lights. They didn't hold hands. They didn't chant. They just stood. Some cried. Some closed their eyes. And some simply breathed. It was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. It was permission. To feel. To remember. To say nothing and still be part of something whole. Keanu remained on the edge of the crowd, the daffodil still in his hand, now cradled like something sacred. He didn't move forward. He didn't speak. But as the wind rustled lightly through the courtyard, someone nearby began humming a melody so soft, so familiar, that a few people turned toward it instinctively. It was the tune of the music box. No words, just memory. Claire's mother was there too, standing near the mural. She held her husband's hand, her other palm resting over her chest. She didn't see Keanu, not at first. But when her eyes scanned the crowd and caught the shape of him, hood low, posture still, she smiled gently, bowed her head, and let the wind move her tears. She didn't approach. Neither did he. Because presence doesn't always require proximity. Sometimes it's enough just to stay close. When the candles flickered stronger, as if pushed by some invisible warmth, the group began placing drawings and folded messages beneath the bench near the book. There were so many that staff brought out a basket to collect them. It filled within minutes. One last child approached the reading room before the night ended. He was small, maybe 5, bundled in a red coat, with sleeves too long and mittens clipped to his sleeves. In one hand he held a small toy dinosaur, in the other a crumpled sheet of paper. He looked around shyly, then tiptoed to the door and slid the paper under the book's display. It wasn't fancy, just a drawing of a fox standing beside a tall star and a caption that read, "I hope she can see it." A nurse nearby bent down and whispered, "I think she can." Then came the soft chime of the hour. 8 o'clock. Time to close the courtyard. But no one moved for a moment. Then, slowly, the crowd began to thin. People left candles where they stood. Some gave small nods to one another as they walked away. No words, just silent acknowledgments of shared weight, shared light. Keanu stayed until nearly everyone had gone. Only a handful of staff remained, gently collecting the notes and drawings for preservation, straightening the fox plush near the mural, wiping smudges from the glass case holding Claire's book. He stepped inside for a final look. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The final page of The Little Prince was still open. The fox, curled beneath the star. He walked over, rested his hand lightly on the edge of the display, and just stood there. No prayer, no speech, just being. Then, carefully, he reached into his pocket and removed the daffodil the little girl had given him. He laid it beside the book. He didn't leave a note. He didn't sign his name. He just left the flower, nodded once, and turned to leave. Outside, the night was colder, but not unkind. He passed a group of nurses huddled together with warm drinks, sharing stories and laughing softly. One of them glanced up, recognition dawning. She didn't speak, just gave him a quiet smile. He returned it. At the edge of the sidewalk, he paused, looked back once. The lights in the courtyard still flickered gently. The fox on the mural still watched over the space. The basket of letters, now full again, rested like an altar of memory and hope. Then Keanu Reeves pulled up his hood and walked into the dark, not to disappear, but to carry the light forward, because that's what Claire had given him. Not a performance, not a headline, but a reason to stay soft in a world that sometimes demanded armor. She had said, "I want to be remembered as someone who loved big." And now, with every candle lit, every child who whispered beside the book, every stranger who stopped to breathe, she was. Her name was Anya. She was 10 years old, and for most of that year she hadn't read a single book, not even when the volunteers offered her stacks of colorful ones, or when her teacher sent short stories from school. Chemo left her too tired. Her thoughts floated, her body ached, and when she did feel strong enough to sit up, she usually just stared at the window or asked to be alone. But one gray afternoon, a nurse named Ella suggested a walk. Not outside, just down the hallway, toward the reading room. "You don't have to read," Ella said gently. "You can just sit. It's quiet there." Anya didn't say yes. She just nodded. That's how they entered the room for the first time. No lights buzzed, no TV played in the corner. Just the hum of warmth, paper, and the soft scent of vanilla from a nearby diffuser. Anya looked around, curious. The bookcase full of children's stories, the framed photo of a girl with a kind smile and big eyes, the open book on the velvet pillow. The Little Prince. "What's that?" Anya asked, pointing. Ella smiled. "That was Claire's favorite book." "Claire?" The nurse nodded toward the photo. "She used to be here, just like you." Anya walked closer and leaned over the book. It was open to a page halfway through, filled with margin notes and gentle underlines. Something sparkled in the corner. A small, pale pink post-it with writing on it in soft pencil. Anya leaned in and read it silently. "You are not your illness, you are your joy." Something tightened in her throat. She blinked, then looked up again. "She wrote this?" "She did." Anya kept reading. Word after word, annotation after annotation, each one like someone had whispered them straight into her tired heart. She sat down on the bench and didn't move for 20 minutes. Ella didn't interrupt. Later that night, Anya asked if she could go back to the reading room, and the night after that. By the end of the week, she was checking out books. Nothing long, just picture books with rich colors and gentle stories. But she started asking questions about characters, asking to keep reading when bedtime came, asking for pencils so she could draw her own fox in a journal. The transformation was quiet, but unmistakable. One afternoon, she turned to Ella and asked, "Did Keanu really come here?" Ella smiled and nodded. "He comes more often than you think." Anya blinked. "Really? Really?" What Ella didn't tell her was that Keanu had already been there 3 times since Claire's passing. No cameras, no security. Just a man who walked slowly, sat briefly, and always left something behind. The first time Keanu returned after the candlelight gathering, it was just after visiting hours. The sky outside was a dusky blue, and the halls were quiet. He wore a baseball cap low over his forehead and carried a book tucked beneath one arm. No staff member escorted him. He knew the way. He didn't speak to anyone that night. He entered the reading room, paused at the doorway, then stepped in and sat near the window. He stayed for only 20 minutes. But when he left, the book he'd brought was on the shelf. Charlotte's Web, with a note inside, "Some things last forever, even if we don't see them." The second time was quieter still. It was snowing. He walked in and saw that the book was open to Claire's favorite page again. "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." He traced the fox lightly with his fingers and stayed in the chair near the bookshelf for over an hour. When he left, he placed a folded piece of paper between 2 pages, though no one read it right away. Later, a volunteer found it. It said, simply, "I still hear her laughter." The third time was when Anya was asleep in her room 2 floors up. He came during a storm, when the lights had flickered briefly and the staff was handing out extra blankets. No one expected visitors that evening, but the front desk nurse saw him pass through the lobby quietly, nodded once, and let him through. That night, he didn't stay long. He left a small, carved wooden fox on the bench beside the book. No note. No explanation. But in the morning, Anya found it. She held it in her hand like it was made of gold. The next day, she told Ella, "If he comes again, I want to give him something." Ella smiled. "What will you give?" "I'll write something," Anya said. "Not about being sick, about something better." And she did. She sat for 2 hours, drawing and writing. A single page with a sunrise in crayon, the words underneath scrawled in bold letters. "The world is still beautiful even when you don't feel good." That's what Claire said without saying it. She folded the page carefully and tucked it into a handmade envelope. On the outside she wrote, "For the man who still hears her laugh." She gave it to Ella and whispered, "Can you give it to him?" Ella didn't promise, but she placed it in the drawer where she kept the other notes left behind, just in case. Because at that hospital, just in case often became enough. 2 weeks later, Ella arrived for her night shift and found a folded paper envelope sitting on the desk at the front of the reading room. It wasn't there when she'd left the evening before, and no one recalled seeing who had placed it there. But the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It simply read, "For Anya." Inside was a page torn from a notebook, written in neat, thoughtful script. "You reminded me that the world is still beautiful too. Keep writing, and keep watching the sunrise." Anya received it during breakfast. Her hands trembled when she opened it. She didn't say much, just pressed it to her chest and whispered, "I knew he'd hear me." After that, she began visiting the reading room daily. Not always to read, sometimes just to sit near the window and draw. Sometimes just to look at Claire's book and leave small sticky notes beside Claire's handwriting. She signed each one with a tiny sun drawn in the corner. More children started to follow her lead. A boy undergoing treatment for a brain tumor added a sticky note beside one of Claire's pages. "I don't feel brave, but I think she was." A girl who barely spoke during group therapy left a folded page beside the fox carving. "It helps knowing someone else cried and kept going." And slowly the room became more than a space. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat. On her last night at the hospital before transferring to an outpatient care unit, Anya returned to the reading room with her parents. She walked around slowly, touching the edge of every book she had read, then sat beside the case, holding Claire's copy of The Little Prince. "I want to leave something here," she told her parents. "Something that stays." Her dad offered to help her write. Her mom offered to draw. But Anya shook her head. "I already did." From her coat pocket, she pulled out a small card. On one side, a crayon drawing of a sunrise over a hill. On the other, in blocky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being brave enough to write," in the margins. She placed it on the bookshelf below the fox carving. Then she turned to the staff gathered near the door, waved once, and walked out. No big goodbye. No dramatic send-off. Just a child carrying the light forward. Later that night, after her family had gone, Ella added the card to the growing scrapbook the hospital kept. She labeled the page with the date, then paused, took one last look around the room, and whispered, "She'd be so proud." Outside, the sky began to lighten, just a hint of dawn on the edge of the horizon. Because some legacies don't echo loudly, they flicker quietly and shine just enough to show someone the way. The package arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. There was no return address, only a hospital logo stamped in the corner and handwriting in uneven block letters across the front. "For Mr. Reeves. Private." It was hand-delivered by a courier to a small film studio just outside of Los Angeles, where Keanu was in the middle of a rehearsal. His assistant placed it gently on the table in his trailer without saying much. She had learned over time that these kinds of envelopes meant something different. He returned later that afternoon, changed out of costume, towel slung over his shoulders, and spotted the package immediately. He sat down, turned the envelope over once, and slowly opened it. Inside was a card, hand-drawn. The front showed a crayon fox, orange and red, standing in a patch of green beneath a large yellow star. The strokes were bold, as if drawn with care but no hesitation. There was something innocent and fearless about it. Not perfect, but full of feeling. Keanu smiled before he even opened the card. Inside, written in careful black ink, were the words, "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." Below it, in smaller handwriting, someone had added, "That's what Claire left for us. Now we carry it." There was no signature, but he knew. Anya. He sat with the card in his hands for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed faintly against the trailer. A bird landed on the fence nearby, then flew off. The hum of quiet surrounded him. He got up, crossed the small room, and opened the drawer of a narrow cabinet. Inside was the music box, the one Claire had given him. It still worked. He had played it only once since the funeral, but he never let dust collect on it. It sat wrapped in a soft cloth, resting beside the copy of The Little Prince she had given him, still marked with her annotations. He placed the card gently beside the music box, the fox on the front facing outward. Then he sat down again, hands folded, eyes on both. There were no tears, just stillness. Because something about the drawing, the effort it took, the message inside, the knowing without ever meeting, tied everything together. Claire's presence, Anya's courage, the room at the hospital, the legacy in the margins. It was all connected. One child's voice making room for another, one gift echoed by another hand. And now, this fox, bright and imperfect and brave, resting beside a music box carved by someone who never asked to be remembered, only to be loved. Big enough to matter. And she was. Keanu stood and reached for the small framed photo he kept on the top shelf. It was a candid picture. A nurse had taken it without posing. Claire and Keanu, side by side on the windowsill bench of the reading room, her head tilted against his shoulder, both of them barefoot, a book open between them. Her smile was soft. His eyes looked forward, not at the camera, but into something distant. as if holding on to every second of that moment. He placed the photo beside the card and the music box. 3 pieces, 3 memories. But none of them frozen, all of them alive. He sat again, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Her voice still lingered in his mind, not just the sound of it, but the way she spoke, measured, deliberate, thoughtful, like every word mattered because time had taught her not to waste it. He could still hear her laugh when the pancake batter spilled, still see the curve of her handwriting when she passed him her copy of the book, still remember the feel of her presence in the room, that gentle gravity. And now, through Anya, it was returning in a new shape. Different, but not lesser, like light changing color through a stained glass window. Anya hadn't known Claire, but she had known her story. She had sat in the same space, touched the same page, whispered her own fears into the silence, and found, somehow, that the silence whispered back. Keanu reached for the envelope again, checking for anything he might have missed. There, tucked between the folded seams, was a tiny pressed flower, a daffodil petal. He held it in his palm. Fragile. Perfect. It reminded him of that night in the courtyard. The little girl with the flower who had said, "Claire said you liked foxes." He had smiled back then and said, "I do now." But now the words felt heavier, more rooted. Because foxes, he'd come to learn, were more than symbols in a story. They were messengers, reminders of taming, of trust, of love that doesn't need to shout. And as he sat with that card beside him, that drawing of the fox under the star, he felt something lift in his chest. Not joy, exactly, not grief, but something older, a kind of reverence. Like being chosen to carry something sacred not because you asked, but because you stayed, because you listened, because you remembered. Outside, a breeze stirred the edge of the curtain. The light shifted just enough to touch the side of the music box, catching on its polished edges. And for a moment, everything was still, not paused, not forgotten, just deeply, beautifully present. That evening, after the rehearsal ended and the rest of the crew had cleared out, Keanu returned to his trailer alone. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat by the small desk, the soft glow of dusk settling through the window. He opened Claire's book once more. The pages were delicate now, worn from being read so often. He flipped until he found the final page, the one with the fox curled beneath the star. Her drawing. No words. Just stillness. He placed Anya's card next to it. 2 foxes, one drawn by a girl who had known time too briefly, the other by a girl who was learning how to carry that time forward. And maybe, he thought, that's what legacy really was. Not a statue, not a plaque, but a drawing passed down, a quote remembered, a gift unreturned but multiplied. He picked up the music box and turned the crank once. The tune was slow, imperfect, a little off-key from the years, but it still played, still echoed. As the last note faded, he whispered into the silence, "You're still here, kid." He didn't mean just Claire. He meant all of them. The children who left and those still fighting. The nurses who stayed late to hold hands. The parents who read bedtime stories beside machines that beeped. The volunteers who cleaned books and changed pages without asking for thanks. They were all part of this. And he, somehow, was a thread in the middle. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a blank card. Simple, white. He took a pen and wrote slowly. She wanted to be remembered not for dying, but for loving. And she is. He folded the card and tucked it behind the photo frame of Claire. Not for anyone else to see, just to keep it near, just to make it real. The next day, before the set filled again with cameras and costumes, Keanu stopped at a local print shop. He had 2 copies of Anya's fox drawing made. One he mailed back to the hospital with a note. She should see how far her joy can travel. The other he pinned on the inside wall of his trailer, right above the small bookshelf where Claire's book rested, where her music box waited, where the fox always faced east. because every morning when the sun came up and touched that card, it reminded him that some lights never go out. They just pass forward. Rain tapped lightly against the windows of the children's hospital, a soft and steady rhythm that hushed the usual hallway sounds. It wasn't the kind of storm that howled or broke things. It was gentler, but constant, like a reminder to slow down, to sit still. Inside, the power had flickered twice already. Lights in the main lobby buzzed and dimmed. Generators hummed into action, casting a softer glow through the corridors. Claire's reading room, tucked at the end of the east hallway, didn't lose its light completely. Emergency fixtures kept it glowing, low and warm like candlelight. The shelves, the mural, the fox sculpture, everything seemed more golden, more sacred in the shadows. That's when Keanu arrived. No announcement, no escort, just him, walking slowly with his hood damp from the rain, shoulders slightly hunched from the chill. The nurse at the desk looked up, nodded once, and didn't say a word. She didn't need to. He walked the familiar path to the reading room, pausing at the entrance. His reflection met him briefly in the glass, then vanished as he pushed the door open. The air inside felt heavier in the best way, weighted with memory, not sorrow. He made his way to the bench by the window, the same spot where Claire once leaned into his shoulder, where Anya had left her card, where countless children had sat and drawn their foxes. He reached for the book, The Little Prince, to open to its final chapter, the pages delicately worn at the edges, some dotted faintly with marks of fingers and tears, a few drawings still tucked inside, folded notes pressed carefully between chapters, like prayers. Keanu turned the page gently and began to read, not out loud, just softly, just for himself. But as he read, the door opened behind him. A small shuffle of shoes, then the whisper of breath as someone sat nearby. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the paragraph, then closed the book halfway and glanced to his right. A boy, maybe 9, sat cross-legged on the floor beside the mural. He had no IVs, no beeping monitors trailing behind him, just a soft blanket draped around his shoulders and a fox plush toy clutched to his chest. Their eyes met. The boy didn't ask who he was. He didn't say anything at all. He just gave a small nod. So Keanu opened the book again, this time a little louder, and read the final chapter. The boy didn't move, didn't speak. He simply listened. As Keanu's voice moved through the story, something about the rhythm of it seemed to echo in the room. The quiet cadence, the soft crackle of rain against the glass, the hum of emergency lights flickering faintly overhead. The little prince spoke of stars and love, of what's invisible and what lasts. Keanu paused only once on a line he remembered Claire had underlined. It is the time you have wasted for your rose that makes your rose so important. He let that sentence linger. The boy blinked, adjusting the way he held his fox plush. Then Keanu continued, page after page until the final lines rested gently on the silence between them. He closed the book, didn't speak, didn't explain, just let the story live where it had landed. The boy turned his face slightly, finally breaking the stillness. I read that part before, he said, but it sounds different when someone else reads it. Keanu looked at him. Sometimes we hear things better when we're not alone. The boy nodded. I like it better this way. They sat like that for a while. No words, no next task, just two people and a story shared in stillness. After a few minutes, the boy stood. He didn't say goodbye. He just gave a small wave, pressed his fox plush to the bench, and walked out. Keanu waited until the footsteps faded, then looked down at the plush toy. A tag was tied around its paw. A child's handwriting, blocky and simple. Listens, just like she did. He placed the toy gently on the shelf beside the framed drawing of the fox Anya had sent. They looked right together, like they belonged in the same frame. Then he stood, stretched slowly, and walked to the far wall. There, above the mural, just beneath a soft, recessed light, was the plaque. He hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe he had, and just hadn't read it fully. This time he did. Claire's reading room. A place to be seen. The letters weren't large. They didn't shout, but they held. They carried weight. Because this wasn't a room about books, or sickness, or even healing in the conventional sense. It was about presence, about letting someone feel seen, not because of what they carried, but because of who they were underneath it. He stood in front of the plaque for a long time, his eyes soft, his breath quiet. Outside, thunder rolled, far away. Too far to scare. Just near enough to remind them all that storms come and go. But stories? Stories stay. Before leaving, Keanu walked once more around the room. He took time with each shelf. He ran his fingers gently across the spines of the books, pausing occasionally when he saw titles that had Claire's tiny notes tucked inside them. One was Charlotte's Web, the same copy he had donated months ago. Someone had added a sticky note to the first page. This one made me cry, in a good way. Another shelf held stories written by children themselves, simple, stapled booklets, illustrated in marker and pencil. One was titled, The Fox Who Waited. It had no author name, just a drawing on the cover, a small fox sitting beneath a tall star. Keanu smiled. He walked to the window, the same one where he had sat with Claire. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The world looked softer, blurred slightly, like someone had painted it with watercolors. He placed one hand on the glass and closed his eyes, just for a moment. Then he returned to the bench, picked up The Little Prince, and left something tucked inside. A single folded piece of paper. He didn't write a message. He didn't sign his name. He drew a fox curled in sleep beside a star. Below it, in small slanted handwriting, Keep loving big. Then he set the book down gently, adjusted the fox plush on the shelf, and stepped out of the reading room. The hallway was quiet. One nurse passed by and smiled, recognizing him. But she didn't stop him, just placed her hand to her heart and kept walking. Back at the front desk, he paused briefly to thank the evening staff. He didn't need to say why he came. They already knew. And when he stepped out into the cool air, the rain had stopped completely. The clouds were beginning to break. And through a small opening above the hospital, one bright star peeked through. He stood there a moment longer, hood still low, hands in his pockets, then turned and walked down the sidewalk. Not hurried, not looking back. Just walking, like always, like someone who had carried grief, and kept walking anyway. The reading room had begun to fill with quiet stories again. New names, new drawings, soft footprints of lives passing through, each child adding something without taking anything away. One afternoon in late spring, just as the dogwood trees outside the hospital began to bloom, a girl named Lily arrived. She was 12, pale and thin from weeks of chemo, and still adjusting to the idea of needing help to walk across the room. She didn't talk much, not because she was shy, but because she had learned to keep her hopes small. She didn't believe in heroes. She didn't believe people stayed. But something about the reading room changed her. It started with the mural. She stood in front of it for nearly 10 minutes the first time she saw it. Her hand rested on the painted tail of the fox, and her eyes kept going back to the plaque, a place to be seen. She didn't sit down that day, just looked. The next time she came back with her nurse, who handed her a copy of The Little Prince and said, "Take your time. You don't have to finish it today." Lily took the book and sat on the floor beside the window. She didn't read it right away. She just held it. And on the third visit, she opened it. Near the center, tucked between two pages, she found the note Anya had once left. "Thank you for being brave enough to write in the margins." Lily smiled, not because she fully understood it yet, but because it felt like someone was speaking to her across time. She began to read. And for the first time since her diagnosis, she didn't feel like a patient. She felt like a reader, like a person again. She returned to the room every day after that. Some days she read, some days she just drew. Her sketches weren't perfect, mostly animals with two big eyes or stars that looked like wobbly flowers, but she filled page after page. And one afternoon, when the sky outside had turned a soft gold and the hospital was humming with the change of shift, Lily pulled a small envelope from her pocket. She placed it gently inside Claire's copy of The Little Prince, between the final 2 pages, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she left the room. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. "I didn't think anyone cared until I came here. I want to be like her, brave and kind." The letters were uneven, but the message was clear. Another voice added to the chorus, another child carrying the light forward. Keanu read the letter 3 days later. He hadn't planned to visit that morning. It was a last-minute stop, just a quiet detour between flights. The sky was pale and heavy with fog when he arrived. He wore the same worn hoodie, jeans, and boots that seemed to keep him grounded, no matter where he was going. The front desk recognized him, but no one said anything. The staff simply stepped aside with quiet smiles. They understood by now, when he came, it wasn't for show. It was for presence. He stepped into Claire's reading room and felt that familiar hush, the kind that didn't ask for silence, but invited it anyway. The light filtered in gently, brushing over the bookshelves, the drawings, the fox mural that had begun to fade just slightly at the edges from so many hands pausing there. He made his way to the bench by the window and saw the book, Claire's copy of The Little Prince. He opened it, instinctively checking for new notes, and found the envelope tucked between the last pages. He turned it over once, then unfolded the paper and read Lily's words. "I didn't think anyone cared until I came here. I want to be like her, brave and kind." He stared at the note for a long time. No music played. No staff entered the room. It was just him, the letter, and the soft pulse of the hospital beyond the walls. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "You already are." The words came from somewhere deeper than his voice, like they were carried forward from every child who had ever sat in that room and found courage between the lines. He folded the note carefully and placed it back where he'd found it. Then he walked slowly to the far wall where the photo collage hung. Over time, families and staff had added more images, snapshots of children curled up with books, volunteers reading aloud, notes scribbled in bright marker. At the center still hung the original photo of Claire and Keanu, and beside it now a new picture had been added, a drawing from Lily. Her crayon fox standing on 2 legs, arms wide open, under a sky full of stars. Keanu stood in front of the wall for several minutes. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he just looked. And then, as he turned to leave, he noticed movement behind him. A boy, maybe 6, stepped into the room and glanced around. He didn't speak, just reached for a picture book from the lowest shelf and sat cross-legged on the rug near the fox mural. Keanu paused, watched him turn the first page, and nodded once before stepping quietly out the door. Down the hallway, Keanu passed a volunteer pushing a cart of books. They exchanged a silent nod. 2 people carrying something invisible and sacred. He didn't head straight for the exit. Instead, he turned left and took a quiet path that curved past the pediatric oncology wing. This hallway was quieter than the others. Photographs lined the wall, smiling faces, murals painted by kids, small messages in childlike scrawl. "I beat it. I'm still fighting. I read 100 books." He paused by one photograph. It was Claire again, in a different frame this time, laughing mid-bite during the pancake breakfast. The nurse in the background was trying to catch falling batter. Claire had flour on her cheek. The moment felt alive. There was no caption on this photo. There didn't need to be. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of folded paper. He'd written it that morning, without knowing why. He unfolded it now and looked it over again. Then, gently, he tucked it behind the photo frame. The message said, "Love doesn't vanish. It leaves notes." As he turned away from the wall, he noticed something else. Another child, maybe 5, with a feeding tube and bright socks, standing just outside the reading room. She looked at the books, not with fear, but curiosity. She was reaching, stretching her fingers toward a cover with a fox on it. A nurse appeared beside her and helped her pull the book down. She opened it. The fox was smiling. Keanu watched for a moment longer, then continued down the hallway. No applause, no dramatic moment, just a man walking away with his hands in his pockets and a memory tucked inside his chest. In the reading room, the boy who had picked up the book earlier was now reading aloud to the fox plush. He didn't know the words perfectly. He stumbled through some of them. But he read with heart. And on the windowsill, Claire's copy of The Little Prince remained open. Inside, her margins now shared space with others. Sticky notes, drawings, smudged pencil lines, and messages from kids who might never meet but somehow knew each other. The book no longer belonged to one girl. It belonged to a legacy. To everyone who ever sat in that room and realized, maybe for the first time, that they mattered. The sun was low over the horizon, casting golden light across the small garden behind Keanu's home. It wasn't a manicured place. The flowers grew in soft, messy clusters. A few vines curled along the wooden fence. A weathered bench sat near the center, half shaded by a Japanese maple whose leaves whispered gently in the breeze. Keanu sat there now, legs crossed, back slightly hunched, a familiar book resting in his lap. The Little Prince. Claire's copy. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers tracing the margin notes she'd written in faded purple ink. Some were thoughtful, little reflections on loss, joy, time. Others were playful. A few were smudged, as though written through tears or laughter. On the inside back cover was her dedication. He'd seen it before, but today he read it out loud. To the man who reminded me I'm more than my hospital bed. He closed the book gently and let it rest on his knees. For a while he just sat. The breeze moved softly around him. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime gave a quiet ring. A bird flitted onto the fence, paused, then flew off again. And then the voice came, not his, but the narrator's, rising like a memory that belonged to everyone listening. Sometimes, what we remember isn't the fame or the films. It's the day someone sat beside us, without needing to fix us, and said, "You matter." There was no rush, just stillness. And that single sentence, hanging in the air like a thread between hearts. Keanu looked out toward the trees, his eyes distant. He had no lines to say, no performance to give. Only the quiet weight of what had been left with him, and what he had chosen to carry. The fox sculpture sat on the edge of the garden wall now, a small cast replica of Claire's original sketch, gifted by the hospital months earlier. Its tail curled around its feet, eyes lifted to the sky. He reached forward and placed the music box beside it, turned the crank once, let it play. The notes were slow, imperfect, but clear. And then, a final voice returned. Soft, direct, kind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who may feel unseen. A pause, not for views, but for the heart they still carry. Another pause. You never know when your presence could be someone's forever. The wind caught the last notes of the music box. They drifted outward, into the branches, into the fading light. And then, click, the music box closed. The fox rested. Later that evening, Keanu stepped back inside and placed the book on his shelf, between two volumes he rarely touched. It wasn't meant to be hidden. It was just meant to be kept safe, a soft place in a quiet home. One story among many, but unlike the others, this one had real fingerprints, a real life behind every sentence. He paused to light a candle and set it beside the window. Not because it was a tradition, just because it felt right. The flame flickered gently, casting a soft glow on the corner of the room. He sat down at the table, his fingers laced loosely in front of him, and allowed the silence to settle again. He wasn't someone who filled empty space with words. He believed in presence. He believed in the things that didn't need to be said to be understood. Outside, the wind shifted, the scent of lilacs drifted faintly through the cracked window. And then came the final words. Not shouted, not scripted, just felt. There are stories we tell the world. A pause. And there are stories the world tells through us. A breath. This wasn't about a visit. Another pause. It was about being seen. Cut to a memory. Claire in the reading room, laughing. Anya drawing her fox. Lily whispering thank you into a book. Then a slow, gentle montage. A boy walking into the reading room alone and sitting in the corner without fear. A volunteer reading aloud to a circle of kids as rain taps the windows. A nurse pausing by the photo wall, fingertips resting over Claire's picture before returning to her rounds. Each frame still, honest. Then, Keanu again, in a hoodie, walking past the hospital, not entering this time, just pausing on the sidewalk, looking up at the window where the mural lives. He places a hand over his heart for a second, then drops it and continues walking. No audience, no press, just a man remembering something important. The narrator's voice returns one last time. Share this story, not to impress, but to remind. Remind someone they matter. Remind someone they are seen. Remind someone that love, quiet, steady love, can echo long after we're gone. Back in the garden, the fox sculpture sits in golden dusk. The candle burns. The music box remains closed. Stillness again. The camera lingers on the book's spine. One word pressed in gold leaf. Prince. The light dims. The screen fades to black. And across the silence appears the final message. In memory of every child who reminded us what courage looks like. Then, smaller text just beneath. Thanks, Claire. The next morning, before most of the city stirred awake, Keanu returned to his garden. This time, he wasn't alone. In his hands, he carried a small box, wooden, smooth-edged, aged with care. Inside it were quiet treasures collected over time. A folded drawing of a fox, Claire's hospital bracelet, a sticky note from Anya, a crayon heart from Lily. They weren't souvenirs. They were stories. He sat again on the bench, watching as the light crept across the grass. The breeze was cooler today, but not unkind. He opened the box slowly and laid each item out across the surface of the bench, touching each one like a blessing. Then he did something rare. He began to write. Not for press, not for public, for himself. He wrote in a small leather-bound notebook, the same one he'd once kept lines in for film rolls. Now it was different. Now it held thoughts, names, sentences he didn't want to forget. He wrote, Claire showed me how much love fits into a single day. Anya reminded me that foxes mean forever. Lily taught me that kindness echoes. And then underlined, we don't rescue people. We show them they were never lost. He closed the notebook, replaced everything back in the box, and held it for a moment longer. Then he stood. He walked to the edge of the garden where a small tree had recently been planted. It was a flowering pear. White blossoms just beginning to show. A stone at its base read, for those who lit the way. Keanu knelt and tucked the box inside a hollow cut beneath the tree's roots. Not buried, just placed. A resting place, a beginning place. He stood again, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked up at the sky. The narrator returned one last time. Maybe we're not meant to understand why some lights leave too soon. Maybe we're just meant to carry them forward. A single note of music returned. Saw. Then, silence. And after a moment, the final message appeared. Not on a screen, not with flair, but with quiet conviction. If this story reached your heart, pass it on. Not for numbers, but for someone who needs to feel seen. Because presence, genuine, still, kind presence, changes lives. Be someone's fox. fade to black. A faint glimmer remains. A single page turning in Claire's book.